Hello and welcome. There's no denying that the Leyland National was a huge success. Maybe not quite as successful as British Leyland would have liked, but it was still a successful vehicle. It's the Marmite of buses, the one that you either love or hate. And to be fair, it wasn't exactly well received when it first started. It was integrally built, which meant that other bodybuilders wouldn't be getting a look in. And the options were decidedly limited. The original concept had a one engine and one transmission choice, if you can call that a choice, 2 lengths and 2 doorway layouts. The interior trim was very basic and also very limited, and externally the choice of colours available again was very limited. But it's safe to say that the Leyland National 2, when that was launched, eventually turned into a totally different bus to these original Leyland Nationals. There were choices of engines, there were choices of gearbox, there were choices of interior trims, and personally I think it's fair to say that had the Leyland National 2 had been born a lot earlier, it would have been a much more successful bus. However, it was born into a time when the bus industry was changing, and not necessarily for the better. The bus grant was starting to be phased out, and passenger figures were dropping. Operators were starting to shift from large, heavyweight traditional buses such as the National through to lighter weight, smaller buses, as smaller sometimes meant less overheads. Now the National was all steel construction, so could hardly be described as a lightweight beast, despite a cheaper, lighter Series B National being available. Now I have done a video on the Leyland National and the Leyland National 2, and it's one of my older videos, so the production isn't quite as good as the later stuff that I turn out. But I'll put a link into it in the top right hand corner if I remember. The engineers at Leyland though had something up their sleeve, and this was started in the latter months of 1983 and was christened the B60. Now, unlike the National, this would have a separate chassis and therefore could be bodied by other bodybuilders. But Leyland would also offer a body for this to make it an integral vehicle. The Leyland bodywork would be mainly built out of aluminium, so therefore would be a lot lighter than the Leyland National with its steel-built body shell. And lighter buses tend to be more fuel efficient. There were 6 of the B60 prototypes made. 3 would be registered and would eventually see service as buses. Of the remaining 3, 2 would remain with Leyland Vehicles Research Department as test vehicles, and 1 would remain as a chassis only. Now, if there's one thing that Leyland had learnt from the Leyland National 2 is that people enjoyed the choice. As I said previously, the original National didn't leave an awful lot of options open for operators, but the National 2 was a completely different kettle of fish. With the National 2 there'd been all sorts of engine choices. There was the 0680 engine, which was later then succeeded by the TL11, and the Gardner 6HLXB, and later the Gardner 6HLXCT, the turbocharged Gardner engine. And this choice of engines, and indeed transmissions, was carried through into this new bus. The first prototype was powered by a 6HLXB, and was destined to be bodied by Alexander. The original chassis was completed way back in November 1983, and the bodywork was fitted in April 1984. Given the registration HXI3006, it was delivered to Citybus in Northern Ireland in December 1985. The second of the B60 chassis was destined to go further afield than Northern Ireland, and this would eventually find its way to Australia. The chassis frame was built by March 1984 and was shipped out to Australia ready to be bodied by Bolton's, where it was fitted with 39-seat dual-door bodywork. It was given the registration 6YY320 and was ready in December 1984. The next 2 B60 chassis were bodied by Leyland, and these are the ones which were initially destined to be development vehicles. However, chassis number 4 did receive 47 seats in its bodywork and was carrying the registration C605LNX. The 5th B60 prototype chassis was registered C544RAO, and this would enter service with Ribble in June 1986, the chassis having been completed in December 1985. The sixth and final B60 chassis was the one that was destined to be a chassis rather than get bodied, and this was the one that was exhibited at the 1984 Motor Show in September 1984. At the Motor Show, it was announced that it would be named the Lynx. Leyland announced that it was hoping that the vehicle would be available in the latter half of 1985, and that it was to be built at the Leyland bus plant at Workington alongside the Leyland National 2, the Leyland Royal Tiger coach, the Olympian and the National-based rail buses. The chassis structure featured open channel section members, and it was an all-welded chassis, and as a result of this, Leyland had installed new robotic welders into the factory to build the chassis. This chassis was, would you believe it, marketed as a low-floor bus at the time, despite it being a step entrance vehicle. And at the front of the bus, the floor was 500mm high. Now, I know that sounds crazy in a world of low-floor buses, but at the time that was actually quite something. The Leyland Lynx would feature air suspension all round. Initially, the Lynx was offered with the fully automatic hydrocyclic 4-speed transmission. However, there would later be an option for a semi-automatic and a ZF fully automatic transmission. Leyland had also anticipated that the Lynx chassis would be available for double-deck bodywork, hence the low floor in the design, and was optimistic that the type could be used as the basis for a pusher-type articulated bus. However, none of these options ever came into fruition, and the only one that was available was the standard single-decker model. The engine was fitted at the rear, obviously, and was longitudinal, or in line, and was horizontally mounted, so it was laying on its side. The Lynx shared the front axle of the Leyland Olympian. Production of the Lynx kicked off in the latter part of 1985, when a development chassis was constructed, and this would feature a TL11 engine. Moving into 1986, production started to pick up pace, with Alexander-bodied buses going to City Bus of Northern Ireland and Leyland-bodied buses going to West Midlands. And indeed, this was the bodywork built on the majority of Leyland Lynxes. Outside, the bodywork of the Leyland Lynx was rather modern looking and slightly boxy, but it certainly wasn't ugly. It had several distinctive body features, such as its squared off wheel arches and its skirt mouldings, its very modern looking at the time bonded windows, which again is something we now tend to take for granted. And of course there was that driver's angled windscreen, wasn't there? Now, driving a bus at night is a horrible thing. Aside from all the drunks and the oiks that tend to hang around and congregate after dark, there's also the issue of reflections in the screen. Even nowadays, when you drive an E400 double-decker bus, for example, and you have all the interior lights on, you will normally be looking at the windscreen and seeing the first 3 or 4 rows of seats with faces looking back at you rather blankly in the reflection of the windscreen, which isn't very good at all, especially when you're driving down dark, unlit country roads. And this is why you'll see a lot of modern double-decker buses driving around with just the offside side of the interior lights lit after dark, as it helps keep those horrible reflections down. But despite what you think of this angled flat windscreen and the one that was also fitted to the similar looking right handy bus bodywork on the Dennis Darts, the reflections were kept right down to a minimum. If only manufacturers would do something like this now, it would be so much better. So it may look a little bit ungainly and a little bit old-fashioned having that angled driver's window, but it really is an absolute blessing when you're doing night driving. Now, a bit like the right handy bus, Leyland had intended to offer a vehicle with a complete one-piece flat windscreen. But while this was a feature of the right handy bus, some of the bodies receiving the flat windscreens, this never happened to the Lynx, and there must have been a collective sigh of relief from all the late shift drivers who had to drive these vehicles after dark. Now, by all accounts, the Leyland Lynx was a very fine bus, but unfortunately for Leyland, there was a bit of a fly in the ointment, and that fly in the ointment was deregulation. And of course in the history books, deregulation tends to eclipse the Leyland Lynx. Now this was a time when a lot of operators faced stiff competition from other operators, big and small. Anyone who had anything with wheels, seats and an engine was going into the bus industry and running bus services. And cost effectiveness was the key word. Many respected old and new bus operators found themselves locked in bus wars on the high streets, and the weapon of choice during these bus wars was the minibus. Not only were these minibuses cheaper to operate, they could also penetrate places that full-size buses couldn't, housing estates being an example. And when operators did buy bigger buses, they tended to be second-hand ones, such as, ironically, Leyland Nationals or Bristol VRs, or even AEC Routemasters. After deregulation, things would never be the same again, and there would never be those pre-1980s size deliveries and orders as there used to be. On top of that, Leyland found itself with more competition from companies such as Volvo and DAF, as well as Dennis and Optare. The Lynx was still entering service in some modest numbers, with companies such as West Midlands, West Riding and Yorkshire Woolen all building up very large fleets. A bit like the National too, the Lynx was popular not only with former National Bus Company operators, but also former PTEs and municipal operators as well. There was a wide range of operators such as Keighley District, Harrogate District, Merthyr Tydfil, Borough Line Maidstone, Cleveland Transit, Busways Travel Services, Nottingham City Transport, Isle of Man Transport, Lothian and Halton Transport. With the vehicles entering service though, there was also yet another blot on the horizon. And this certainly wasn't anything to do with deregulation. It was soon discovered that the Lynx hadn't had as much research and development done as the Leyland National. This was seen in the rusting in the welded box section of the chassis, and this was all down to the poor anti-corrosion treatment of the steel that they had used. Now at this point you can't help feeling sorry for West Midlands Travel, as West Midlands PTE had become. They'd bought thousands of MCW Metro buses, and let's be fair, the Metro bus isn't actually known for its ability to not rust. We operated them for a while at Eastern Ways, and there was a running joke that you never actually had to scrap a Metro bus, you just hit it very hard with a hammer and swept up what was left. Now don't get me wrong, I like Metro buses, but that ability to rust is one of those things that's put me off a little bit, to be fair. So aside from that, West Midlands then bought a large fleet of Leyland Lynx, which again had a tendency to rust. They must have been left feeling quite despondent after all that. And to be honest, who can blame them? In 1988, Leyland was sold to Volvo, and this would see the introduction of the Cummins L10 engine with ZF transmission, replacing the option of a Leyland engine. 1990 would see the launch of the updated Lynx 2. Production of the original Lynx ended with 910 of them being built. The most obvious difference, of course, being that these buses had a little snout at the front. This being there to make room for the intercooler in front of the radiator. Again, the first few were development vehicles. The first one was a development chassis, and the second two were for Volvo Leyland Bus. Production got underway in the autumn of 1990, with the first one being delivered to Wright of Wrexham with the registration of H256YLG. Customers that had taken the original Lynx came back for the Lynx 2. With the Lynx 2, the corrosion issues seem to have been a little bit more sorted out, and later the Volvo THD series engine would become the standard unit. However, this resurrection of the Leyland Lynx would be all too brief, and in August 1992 the final Lynx would come off the production line at Workington, and this would be for Halton and registered K853MTJ, and was given the fleet number 57. This was a 51-seat bus. Now 7 years earlier, Halton had taken the last Leyland National C49 OCM, which had been given the fleet number 33, so this was a nice way to round things off. And I think it was a nice nod to the Lynx's predecessor, the National, that the last one should go to the same operator. there would only be 142 Lynx 2s built. The Lynx's successor was the Volvo B10B, which was, like the Lynx, a rear-engined single-decker bus with a step entrance. In addition to the home market, there was a small number of Lynxes exported as demonstrators. However, despite these demonstrators, no sales abroad ever resulted. As I mentioned right at the beginning, one of the B60 prototypes was sent over to Australia, where it was bodied by JW Bolton of Perth, and it operated for Transperth Action and Hornibrook bus lines. It was later sold to Lever Coach Lines in 1987. In 1989, 2 further Lynxes were bodied by Pressed Metal Corporation as demonstrators for the State Transit Authority. However, this demonstration never happened, and they were sold to John J. Hill of Wollongong. In 1990, 3 of the West Midlands travel batch being built were sent to Australia as demonstrators instead of going to West Midlands. 2 were demonstrated to Action, while the 3rd was demonstrated to the State Transport Authority and the State Transit Authority, before all 3 of them were sold to South Trans. Singapore Bus Services took a Leyland Lynx in 1988, and this was fitted with Walter Alexander bodywork. Confusingly though, this was involved in an accident in August 2001, and its original Lynx style front panel was replaced with an Alexander PS style front panel. Fortunately, there's various examples of this rather fine bus, and indeed Leyland's swan song, in preservation. And they're always a pleasure to see and indeed hear, because they actually sound really nice when they're running and driving. Now, of all the buses I've been involved with, I must admit the Leyland Lynx is one that's kind of passed me by over the years. I remember travelling on one of the Keithley ones many years ago when I was a child, and being quite impressed with it, to be fair. It seemed to go quite well from my teenage perspective. And again, well over 20 years ago, I actually drove one, if only very briefly, as a friend of mine was operating one on rail replacement service and said, "Would you like to have a go?" And I did. And I have to admit, it kind of reminded me of driving a single-decker version of the Metrobus. In fact, I think had MCW built a single-decker version of the Metrobus, it would have resembled the Leyland Lynx. In fact, I remember thinking that, apart from the obvious Leyland driving position, that it was just like a Metrobus to drive. It did pretty much everything you wanted it to do, in all fairness, in the short time that I drove it anyway. And it was fairly quick off the mark as well. In fact, the only problem I can recall with this particular bus was the centre lights kept falling down. I'm not sure if my friend ever got that problem fixed or not. So if you was a passenger on a Leyland Lynx in Kent in the early 2000s on rail replacement work and got cabooshed on the head by the interior lights, you'll remember the bus well. Well, we've reached the end of this rather potted history of the Leyland Lynx. Probably fair to say the unsung hero of the single-decker buses. And like the Leyland National too, it's a shame that it wasn't launched earlier. I think even 5 years earlier would have made it a much more popular model than it actually already was. And it certainly wasn't a failure at the same time. I suppose it was just one of those buses that was born too late. So now I'm going to hand this over to you. What are your memories of the Leyland Lynx? Did you used to drive them? Did you used to travel on them regularly? Come on, I'd love to hear your stories. How did you think it compared to the Leyland National? Or indeed the Volvo B10B that followed? Please remember though, this was a potted history of a vehicle that was in production for a number of years, so I may well have left bits out or omitted bits and pieces. If I've left something out that's important to you, I do apologise. Please comment down below and let me know what that is. And tell me what I've been missing out on the Leyland Lynx over the years. If you did enjoy this video, please like and share it. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss the future releases in this and my other series here on YouTube. I'd like to thank all the new subscribers that have come over to the channel and started watching all my videos. And I hope you're enjoying the content. If there's anything at all that you'd like me to look at or cover, put a comment down below and let me know. And whilst I can't promise I'll do everything, I'll certainly have a look into it and see what the feasibility of it is. It's always great to get feedback, as long as it's not like, can you cover the Leyland GNU or something like that. Although I expect there will be 1 or 2 of you who would love a video on the Leyland GNU. I'm not knocking it. Thank you so very much for watching. Bye for now.